Right, have you managed to hide your whiskey, Gavin?
I've given them other things, including my pint for Lent. But I have hidden my whiskey. Well, I'm now drinking out of a mug. The outside is beautiful. The inside is full of who knows what.
Right, 55 then. Hello and welcome to Catholic Unscripted, episode 55. I'm Katherine Bennett.
I'm Mark Lambert.
I'm Gavin Ashenden.
And on my computer, Mark Lambert, you're quiet. So,
Yeah, really?
Yes. Where's your little mic thing that you... Are you not
one.
using your little collar mic?
No. I'll give you a long explanation.
Never mind. We just speak up. We have a lot to talk about. So today, well, recently you may have noticed the news that Tucker Carlson, formerly of Fox News in America, went to Russia and spoke to Vladimir Putin, and was also, as far as I could see, very impressed with the trolley system, where you put in your money and then
the trolley, yeah.
and then return it, so that on trust. Wonderful trolley system there in Russia, and also St Patricks Cathedral in New York City, just a couple of days ago, held the funeral of a male transgender sex worker. Apparently, the priest had been duped and didn't know that this was who the funeral was for, apparently an atheist, and all the furore around that. Also, in Greece becomes the first Orthodox nation to legalise same-sex marriage, so the culture war is going on everywhere. There's no escaping it for those who want to flee and run. And we have the news that Sister Poacher, Linda Poacher, a Salesian nun, who has come out and said that the Pope Francis, is in favour of women deacons. We just need to see how we can get this through. And we don't know whether the Pope is in favour or not, because we haven't heard from him. So there's some ambiguity to work with again. So we began. Well, let's begin with this then, Mark. So tell us who this Sister Poacher is and what she's been saying.
She came out, so that they were invited to the Council of Cardinals, what they call the C9, which is Pope Francis's advisory council of cardinals. And there was a lady, a woman Anglican dressed as a bishop, who went along, and there was and she was invited by this Sister Linda Poacher, who's a Salesian sister, someone who's, I think, well known for being, prominent sort of advocate for female ordination. And she basically came out of it and made a statement and said that the Pope is in favour of a female diaconate, and they're just trying to work out how to implement it. Mm-hmm. And this is absolutely devastating as far as I'm concerned, because it would just bring about utter chaos in the church, because there's not different degrees of, really this is about the priesthood, because once they've implemented holy orders for women at one level, then it will be, well, we've got holy orders for the diaconate, why not have it for priests or bishops? And it, obviously the teleology, it will go, will go in that direction. And you'll end up, because there's the problem, so the church has ruled on this on a number of occasions, and it said that there's no mandate for it. The diaconate was something that was implemented by the Holy Spirit through the apostles in the Catholic Church, and there is no female diaconate. There's no ordination for females anywhere in the Old Testament. That they've had a commission under Pope Francis that investigated this, and they came. This was what they decided. They came out and said that this was the situation. Pope John Paul II said that that the church cannot do this. It cannot ordain women, and the reason is it's really important ontology, because it's about what is, inherent about being a man and what's inherent about being a woman. And it's the church admitting that we don't have the power to change those created realities. So it's a really foundational sort of thing. And it's saying that, what's proper to women and what's proper to men. And it's nothing to do with a lack of equality. It's to do with the fact that everyone has got their own proper roles, and men can't have babies. And Jesus was, like people who are in persona Christi, Jesus was a man. And that's fundamentally the argument. Go on, Gavin, I can see you chomping at the bit.
I think the best thing about I am chomping at the bit. I think the best thing about this whole event was that it gave Katherine Bennett reason to write her blog for members. And I've been following this argument since 1977, really. And I thought Catherine's piece was really good. And I hope what she'll do is reiterate part of it, because the way in which she describes women's vocation as being mothers hasn't normally been part of it. But if I can just make a few background remarks. I mean, one is somebody put in our questions, could we please give some attention to the fact that a lot of people have swallowed the argument that culture is different and Jesus was limited by the culture of his day. This is something progressives always say, and it's actually ludicrous in one sense to imagine that the whole incarnation gets restricted by whatever the local customs of the Jews were. So that isn't true. It's a myth put around by progressives. Secondly, I'm sure everybody knows that much of the Old Testament is taken up with the fight between Sky Father and Earth Mother. All the Canaanite fertility religions were the children of Israel moving back to Gaia and fertility worship in order to placate the women goddesses. All other religions had priestesses. And this temptation to placate the earth instead of praying to the Father is part of the way in which the tension between trusting God, the Creator, and getting caught up in supporting creation, just like Gaia has become. The whole ecological movement is another manifestation of this, the people turning to look after the Mother Earth as if she created us and as if we are bound to her. But the other thing I can say is that if what they did was to invite Joe Bailey Wells in to impress the Pope and the Cardinals, they've made a serious mistake. I have to be careful here, not to be rude, but Joe Bailey Wells doesn't have any episcopal responsibility anymore because she's screwed up rather within the Church of England. She's not very competent. She's married to the vicar of St Martin's in the Fields, and she and her husband were chaplains at Duke University, and they came away underwhelming people with her competence. He's a bit sharper, but he's not very happy. So if they've produced her as part of this kind of women's syndicate to try and persuade the cardinals that women's ministry is a good thing, I think she will have probably shot herself and the whole thing in the foot. They'll come away thinking, if this is what we're going to be offered within the Catholic Church, maybe we shouldn't take the bait. So it is true, it's a political coup for the feminists in the Vatican and for the trousered nuns. They've gone around saying that the Pope is in favour of it, though we don't know if he is or isn't, but that sounds like the normal disinformation campaign based on ambiguity, same stuff we've always had. As Mark was saying earlier on, it would produce schism if it's going to happen. Not even Francis can overturn the magisterium to that extent. So I think it's really designed to be something to get us into a tizzy. But it's given the opportunity to remind us of what vocations men and women are called to. And I wonder if this is the moment for Katherine to reiterate her thesis, because I think it's a very good one.
Well, first of all, I don't think it will happen. I do think it's a case of getting into a tizzy. However, people like clarity and want to understand our Holy Mother Church is Mater e Magistra, mother and teacher. So people want to learn. They want to know why the Church teaches what she teaches. So yes, I think you began by saying it's people say, oh, Jesus lived in this time and he was bound by these cultural rules, as if he wasn't God. It's just, it's amusing. And the figure of Jesus wasn't somebody who challenged in all sorts of ways, who called women daughters of Abraham. You just wouldn't have had that, that the idea that he was somehow sexist because, he was just stuck in this time. And let alone, as you say, priestesses were actually quite a common thing in the ancient times. So it wasn't even that. We can't just simply look back and say, well, now we're in the modern day, we can have priestesses. The idea of the priesthood all through the Old Testament was very, very strict and very confined. Anyone outside of the tribe of Levi couldn't be a priest. So this idea of the priesthood being very definite and chosen and set by God it's very clear. So I think some of the ideas that the call women, often women, but some men too, make for women priests is taking the view that we've somehow invented the priesthood. But of course, we didn't invent the priesthood, we received it. And so any call for women to be priests is simply saying we don't accept what's been given. So it's a rejection of what our Lord has given to us. And anyone who wants to, I write quite a bit about this. I wrote an article just last week, prodigals in the pig muck. So I'll link it here, and another one a few weeks before that. So it is something I'm interested in, and I think a lot of it goes back to this inability to really recognise what women are as the embodiment of femininity. So we hear in Genesis that woman is mother of the living. This is hardly a title to be sniffed at. So if we've got, it's such a, I think, this way of thinking, well, if men can do this, we must be able to do that, and that's equality. Instead of seeing equality as not as uniformity. So what is it the Catechism says? That, I think, equality is not uniformity. So whereas we see it in that way. So yes, you could. I don't need to go through all the points because we've got a lot of talking points, but I'll link the article here. And at the root of it is just the idea that we have to recognise woman, as Mark said, for what woman is as distinct from man, and celebrate that. And in fact, women need to recognise that they are called to be mothers, spiritual mothers, to be biological mothers. And just as we get annoyed in our culture when men present themselves as women and beat them in all the races, and we get outraged, quite rightly. Why? Because what are they doing? What are they doing trying to pretend to be women and compete with women? This is for women. And just like that, it is a woman's role to be mother of the priest. It's Our Lady's role to be mother of Christ. So those demanding, I want to be a priest, they're not just rejecting their own womanhood, their own femininity, and the consequences of that, but they're also, it's an offence against men, because only men can be priests. And we wouldn't be happy if a whole load of men walked around stamping their feet saying, I want to be the mother of a priest. No, sorry, that's not for you. That's for women. Gavin.
I want to risk being sexist, no, but I'm not quite sure how to say this safely, but I'll try it anyway and hope that people will be charitable to me. One of the very interesting things in Anglicanism is the way in which women turn masculine when they enter the priesthood. They wear black, they cut their hair, they go for the lesbian look, and it's really very distinctive and a bit alarming. You have to say, well, why are you deliberately obscuring your femininity and adopting a masculine persona? And I don't think it's just in order to be professionally more powerful. I think it's a very accurate example of the confusion of sexuality. The instinct that actually priesthood is masculine, and so to be a priest, I need to look masculine. There are some women who don't do that, but then they fall into a difficult problem. And I recognize at this point that men and women have different ways of looking at each other. But the problem with long-haired, curvy priestesses is that it's very difficult for men to look past them iconically and through them to the Holy Trinity, because actually the signals that get sent off to men, at least, and I think to some women too, are that the women's sexuality has a different effect optically. So, in other words, you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. For women, in the sense that they either adopt masculinization in order to deprive themselves of their femininity, or they adopt their femininity, which is actually at odds with what a priest ought to be offering people, because there's an element of of optical confusion. Let's put it that way. It just doesn't work. And I think the thing that I was just most impressed with was that if Catherine's right and the essential vocation of womanhood is to be mothers and grandmothers, to be the glue that holds the family together and therefore society, the only way in which a woman can be a priest is to, if you like, adopt a capitalistic, mechanistic model of humanity and say, it's more important, what I do is more important than who I am. We're back to function over ontology. And that's profoundly anti-Christian. And apart from that, go on, Mark, take over, sorry.
Well, no, it's Descartes over Aquinas, isn't it? It's, I think before I am over, I am, being precedes action.
Exactly that. Yeah.
I think it's interesting that it's Pope Francis is, he's been this big crusader against clericalism. And surely this is the biggest example of clericalism you could get, that we haven't got any power in the church unless we're clericalized, unless we're... It's a completely wrong-headed idea of what it means to be a priest, a man for others, the servant of the community, and the icon of Jesus Christ. It's so bad and so confusing. And the trouble for me is that it's, again, another thing where this nun has come out in the Vatican and made this statement saying that the Pope is in favour of this. And from the Vatican press corps, there is, from the press office, there's silence. They haven't said, oh, no, the Holy Father's not in favour of it. They've just let it slip through. And it's like so many other things, like the Scalfari interviews, where the Pope says some, like to Cardinal Hollerich. Cardinal Hollerich has said that the Pope has said to him that the church is wrong on its teaching on homosexuality. And there's been no clarification on any of these issues. And all this is doing is causing huge confusion and pain in the church. And it just goes on and on and on. Where does it end? It's like he does that two-step thing. He does something heretical, then he does something orthodox, like the last thing, Gestes Obisque, which everyone was like, oh, well, there you go, that's fairly orthodox. And now he's back to signalling heresy again, which is just...
Yeah. I think what you said there is important. It's a misunderstanding of the priesthood, and the failing to correct it means that misunderstanding can prevail. And so what we need is some clarity on what the priesthood actually is. And you spoke, so yes, it's this idea of the visible. Only that which is visible can be recognised, can be celebrated. And I wrote recently about how Gertrude von der Fort talks about this, that the feminine element is the invisible pillar that gives integrity to all that is visible. Now, if you swipe away that invisible, and as Catholics, we should be very comfortable with this language, the invisible made visible, and the participation and the reality. And so if we swipe that away, the invisible element, and we all then just have the visible, there's no integrity. So I think it's difficult to talk about, because when you say women are mothers, it's too easy to look at that on a simple biological level and say, well, some women can't be mothers and some women aren't mothers and some women are called not to be mothers. But in a sense, you're still always a mother. We are all, as women, mothers. It tells us in Genesis, mothers, but we have to understand motherhood more generally or more broadly and more symbolically and deeper than we understand it. And some will be called to be in a very specific way to be mother to my child. But all women are called to be mothers to all. And what is that element, that invisible that gives structure? So this call to be a priest. Sorry, Gavin, I can see you're itching again.
Well, I am. You're so kind, so my body language awful. I discovered a nun channel on YouTube the other day. You can imagine how excited I was about that. And I came across these two wonderful nuns, and they were talking about their vocation, and they were both very feminine in the very best sense. And they were saying that we go into school and children look at our fingers and we have a wedding ring on, and we say we're married to Jesus. And so these are not mothers. These are brides of Christ. In other words, I want to take up your very sensible point, but not all women can have children. It's true. although they comprise of a category of humanity for whom children are the only potentiality. I mean, men can't. But not all women have children. But all women become brides of Christ in one sense, and nuns in particular. In other words, there's a degree of femininity which is more than just motherhood. But that's what one of the things that nuns do. So again, we're trying to make the distinction between fatherhood and motherhood. And it's interesting, isn't it? That the latest, 10 more seconds, the latest assault of cultural Marxism on Christianity is the confusion of this difference between men and women with the whole transgender movement. It's not just a political movement, it's a spiritual movement.
Yeah, and this idea of femininity, it's important to look at femininity and masculinity and femaleness and maleness as well. So one of the things that's overlooked often, I think, is that we are all feminine before Christ. You, Gavin, you, Mark, me, Katherine, are feminine before Christ, who is masculine. The church is feminine, Holy Mother Church. When the priest is in persona Christi, Father Danny or whoever, he is acting in the person of Christ, and at that point masculine. But as Danny, as Tom, as Henry, they are also feminine before Christ. It's not that the man, once he becomes a priest, loses his identity as the man, but that when he acts in the person of Christ, he is then, his maleness, his masculinity is significant. That
what
femininity
you're saying is that role
as receiving. Yeah. So you understand that you're feminine. So when you think about the language we use, we call land her, we call a ship her. Why do we do it? Because what that thing is in relation. So the land, the piece of land, is inhabited. So it's always she. It's always referred to as her. The ship is her, and those who sail in here, whether male or female, are masculine in relation to the ship that is feminine.
So I think what you're saying, you're just about role and ontology.
Katherine, is what?
Well, please forgive me because it sounds I'm being patronising. I'm really sorry, but I think what you're saying, I think what you're saying can be summed up more succinctly to the relationship between role and. I'm so sorry. I'm sorry. I apologise. I'm so sorry. I really apologise profusely. But I think it's about role and ontology.
The Uriah Heep thing. Come on. Go on.
But I've been thinking about this for a while, and I think it's role and ontology. Ontology and role are always present, but sometimes they're complementary. So ontologically, I'm a man, I'm masculine, but sometimes I slip into the role of femininity as a member of the church. So this is not confusion or contradiction. This is more like the overlaying of categories, but each category retains its integrity. So I don't suddenly become a theological transsexual. And the way of avoiding confusing the two is to maintain clarity about role and ontology, and recognizing that sometimes one moves into one and then into the other, depending on if you're talking about being part of the bride of Christ. I may have made things more confusing, in which case I retire in dust and ashes and Lenten humiliation.
But we're talking about who we are as Christians before Christ. So we always receive creation from God. We receive grace in the sacraments. We receive forgiveness. We are, in that sense, feminine. So feminine as a principle, and then the female body, that's with the womb, is the embodiment of that. That's that harmony between the feminine and the female. So of course it doesn't render you a eunuch or a transgender bloke if we say that. Instead it gives clarity, I think. To let me read this short piece by Pope John Paul II from Mulieris Dignitatem. He says, being the bride, the church, and thus the feminine element becomes a symbol of all that is human. Since Christ, in instituting the Eucharist, linked it in such an explicit way to the priestly service of the apostles, it is legitimate to conclude that he thereby wished to express the relationship between man and woman, between what is feminine and what is masculine. It is a relationship willed by God, both in the mystery of creation and in the mystery of redemption. It is the Eucharist above all that expresses the redemptive act of Christ, the bridegroom, towards the church, the bride. This is clear and unambiguous when the sacramental ministry of the Eucharist, in which the priest acts in persona Christi, is performed by a man. Pope John Paul II, saint.
Remember that when we had it made sense. Yeah. Sorry.
He made sense. Yeah. Good. Well, so that's one thing we've been looking at, and another is this funeral at St Patricks in New York City. A transgender sex worker whose name I've forgotten. I think it's Cecilia Gentili or something. Born a male and presents as female, and apparently the funeral was booked because he was such an icon, and it was decided that this person should be have a funeral service at an iconic building, and it was packed out with people in fishnet stockings, and there was a point at which they spoke about Cecilia and called her, or rather said, I want to get this right, even though it will offend. So this was on Thursday. They held this for transgender sex worker, actor and self-proclaimed atheist. A picture near the altar depicted a haloed Cecilia, surrounded by the Spanish words for transvestite, whore, blessed and mother. This whore, one guest proclaimed, to whoops and cheers from the mourners. This great whore, Saint Cecilia, mother of all whores. And this was in St Patricks Cathedral. And of course, anyone who knows anything about Saint Cecilia is that she is a virgin martyr of the church, perhaps the first incorrupted saint. So here we are, and St Cecilia has been called a whore in a Catholic cathedral to cheers and whoops. So it's not very good, is it, Mark?
Well, yeah, it's awful. Of course, it does seem like another example of where the church has tried to be, well, it's like we're, in this epoch that we're going through now, we seem to forget the fundamentals of what we believe and what we understand in this pursuit of mercy or something, friendship, I don't know. And in doing so, we're constantly embarrassed. And we've said on this channel a number of times that it's like feeding a crocodile. You know, when you're with these sort of, with people who are in this much spiritual pain, I think any sort of capitulation in this regard, and people are trying to be generous out of love. I can see that that's what's going on, but it always ends in a travesty. It always ends up in a disaster, and it seems that the priest or whatever, and the pastor at St Patrick's wasn't aware how this was going to work out, and he has issued a statement since all this sort of broke, which I think I can share with you. Hang on. He says confidently. There we go. Right, ready? So this was the statement. So thanks to so many who have let us know that they share our outrage over the scandalous behaviour at a funeral here at St Patrick's Cathedral earlier this week. The cathedral only knew that family and friends were requesting a funeral mass for a Catholic and had no idea our welcome and prayer would be degraded in such a sacrilegious and deceptive way. That such a scandal occurred at America's parish church makes it worse. That it took place as Lent was beginning, the annual 40-day struggle with the forces of sin and darkness, as a potent reminder of how much we need the prayer, reparation, repentance, grace and mercy to which this holy season invites us. As the Cardinal has directed, we've offered an appropriate mass of reparation. I mean, I don't know if the place needs to be reconsecrated.
Yeah, it's bad, isn't it? Sorry. Yes. But that's good. It's Cardinal Dolan, isn't it? What do we know about Cardinal Dolan? Timothy Dolan.
I always was a big fan of Dolan, and he always was able to articulate the faith in a very eloquent way. And he always, under Pope Benedict, seemed right on side. But under Pope Francis, he seemed to be lost. He's gone in all kinds of different directions. There's, concerns that he's been covering things up, and I don't know. What do you say about these people? It's all kinds of wrong, isn't it? It's no good for the church at all. So, but more recently, Dolan's been coming out with some more Catholic stuff. So you can imagine they're in an impossible, we've said many times on this channel, haven't we, that no Catholic wants to be in a position where they find themselves criticising the Pope. And so you're trying all the time to find the good and, sort of find a way of accommodating the reading today, the gospel reading today. Was it Matthew? And it was that reading that says, it was like, the sick, it's the sick who need a doctor, not the well. And, I came for sinners and to call them to repentance. And just that line, really struck me how at odds that is with this papacy. The call to repentance is what is consistently missing. And this is just another example where the generosity, if you want to call it generosity of Pope Francis, I hope and believe that it is a generosity and a willingness to reach out to all people, none of us would deny that everyone is welcome in the church. Everyone is, that's why it's important, it's because it's transformative and you can be free from those chains of sin. So it's really important, but we have to call sin where there's something at odds with the good, the true, the beautiful. You're in a position where you have to be able to really help someone. You have to be honest about the fact that is going to be a problem. And when that's absent, this is what you end up with. It's just a mockery. People don't, it's confusing. You can't explain it to anyone and no one understands what it means.
And perhaps predictably, Father James Martin has said what a wonderful thing it was to celebrate. And isn't it a sign, this funeral mass, he said, and isn't it a sign that this wouldn't have happened 10 years ago, and how accepting the church is of LGBT people who shouldn't be labelled in that way anyway, and also implies that they were never welcome in the church. So it's so wrong on so many levels, what he said. And
one track record.
I think of
one reason for being a priest, and that is to change church teaching. I can't understand how he's still allowed to carry on.
No, I really don't understand that. I was saying to you, because I'm trying to write a little something about it at the moment, you think of the thief on the cross, the penitent thief, and there he was next to Jesus. And in that moment, he's a thief. The idea that somehow taking the position that this is not something to celebrate means you hate people and you don't love people and they need help. Yes, that's it. That's the point. We all need help. But what help is it to just go and sit and celebrate with them? That's not helpful to anyone. So the penitent thief said to the other, look, we deserve this. We deserve it, mate. But this guy doesn't. And in that moment of recognising the innocence of Christ and the love of Christ and his own sinfulness, Christ responds, today you will be with me in paradise. So it's not. Of course, the church is a hospital for the sick, but it has to really do something. It has to be efficacious. There have to be real doctors, real physicians who can heal. It can't just be a movie set. Here's a building full of actors. It has to be real. And so I find that really disappointing when you see clergy, when you see priests come out and say, yay, let's celebrate this inclusiveness that doesn't take anybody anywhere. And these are poor, suffering, damaged people. That poor person who died, a transgender sex worker, how much suffering have they experienced in their life? How much suffering did so many of those people that attended that funeral do experience in their life? And how much love, real love, do they really need that they're not getting at this opportunity when they could otherwise have? Gavin?
My reflection is that this is spinning by Sister Poacher and Father James Martin, and that what happened in the cathedral was pastoral incompetence. They don't appear to know what they were doing, and consequently they made some mistakes. And I think, as Katherine said, it's a great shame, though, because some of the most wounded people imaginable were in that congregation. And by greeting them in the way they did, the rather silly priest who was presiding just whipped them up into a kind of celebration of their own campness. We haven't seen people this well turned out since Easter. He was trying to be friendly and trying to be affirmative, but his antennae were really rather badly short. As you were saying, this was a moment an opportunity to reach out to people who were profoundly wounded and to bring them back into the Catholic Church. That's one of the things that funerals give the clergy an opportunity to do. They mustn't be seen as factory lines in which people get dispatched, but as opportunities for pastoral evangelism, for prophecy, for healing. They required paying attention to. And on this occasion, the cathedral staff weren't paying attention.
Mm. Well, we can thank God there is now a massive reparation, and as Mark said, is that enough? This is awful. But what we can do anyway is to pray for the repose of the soul of this person, Cecilia Gentili, and for all those who attended the service. Then we have a couple more, and perhaps a bigger one, which might need a bit more time than we have. But just a quick mention of the fact that Greece has become the first Orthodox nation to legalise same-sex marriage. What can we say about it? Is this a surprise, Mark?
Well, no, it's a symptom of the culture war that's engulfing the whole world, isn't it? So I do find it sort of interesting that our Orthodox brothers and sisters often say that this isn't something that's affecting them. And Greece obviously is a Christian nation, so it's deeply disappointing to see it capitulating to the secular narrative in this way. And it's the same argument that we see time and time again, which is about equality and being nice and, all these sorts of things. But I think really under the surface, what you see is it's an abandonment of Christian truth. And it's a symptom of that, of the constant battle between the revelation and the secular narrative, like the rule of the enemy. And it's such a shame, really, that we're losing that battle. But there's little wonder that we are, and it's just a sign to me that the Orthodox are losing it as well as we are.
I think it's a sign of the tension between. I don't want to rerun Brexit, but I'm sure that the EU would have been strongly involved in the impetus to get this change of legislation done at a secular level. Greece is a very interesting place. The Greek Orthodoxy has a great deal of power in the state, but it's still limited. There's a life and death struggle going on for the soul of Greece, between Orthodoxy on the one hand and secular Greek politicians, in this case, aided and abetted by the EU. And as Mark was saying, it means that Orthodoxy is on the back step again, and the secularists are on the front step. So this is part of the fight for the soul of Europe, and Europe is dying slowly, and this will speed the death up if there isn't some form of Christian, recapturing of the public imagination. One of the things we should be doing, I think, is explaining that there appears to be a death wish in Europe, isn't it? Freud talked about Thanatos, the death wish. We're not replicating. There aren't enough children. This is going to be economically impossible. We've brought in a solution from Islam with mass immigration. No one's going back to and perhaps this takes on to our next subject. No one's going back to asking what is so amiss philosophically that we've jettisoned Christianity and all the Christian virtues, and yet are not solving any of the problems that come from having endorsed secular values, which are so bad for humanity, bad for economies, bad for society.
Well, that does bring us neatly to our final point of discussion today, which is Russia. And for Russia, it's you might say it's in their interest to keep the West concerned with these silly matters, because, of course, it does weaken a nation. It weakens our society. We all read a piece by John Zmirak, who was talking about Putin and Russia adopting Christianity as a way of cohesing the nation rather than necessarily a genuine faith. Well, we can't know that. But Tucker Carlson recently went to interview Putin, and he's been pushing a lot of pro-Putin and pro-Russia stuff for quite some time, so the interview wasn't a total surprise. But although it's a political matter, what can we say about this that might be useful to our viewers, Mark?
Well, I think it's a really interesting subject for lots of different reasons, and there's a lot of different things in play here, and obviously it encompasses what's going on with the war in Ukraine, where we've got, and from my perspective, and what's interesting is that we're able to have this sort of discussion and bring in different perspectives. So you've got, well, it seems to me that you've got like Tucker Carlson and Trump supporters. Basically, Trump is going to be the Republican candidate, it looks like, all by the shouting, in the next election. So we've got a rerun of Trump v. Biden. Biden is pumping money into the Ukraine to defend against Putin's aggression. Tucker Carlson obviously is a Republican supporter, so he's been a lot more pro-Putin. And that narrative is basically that it's not our war. By funding Ukraine, what we're doing is just bringing more death and destruction to Ukraine, because the Russians will not stop. If there's one lesson that we learn from history, it's that they just throw more men into the meat grinder, then even if it's just by force of numbers on its own, that a war of attrition will result in a Russian sort of victory. And so we'd be better off just quitting while we're ahead and, like coming to some sort of agreed settlement now where Russia gets the Donbass or whatever and Ukraine is left alone. And who knows? I don't know what the rights or wrongs of that is. I do know that the dominant narrative in the West, and something that I've always, as a Catholic, I believe in subsidiarity. I believe in the right of people to decide for themselves what they're allowed to do. I've obviously got a deal of some degree of antagonism towards Russia and communism, although on the counter side there, what you've got is Putin now, and this is to Mirek's point, is like Constantine. Putin is using Christianity to rebuild Russian society because communism was a cancer that almost destroyed their country. So that sort of, I think you've got to be aware that Mirek is coming at it from that, sort of pro-Putin-ish. And as a Brit, I'm looking at some of the things that have happened over the last few years. I mean, over the last 20 years, we've had some it's hard to not see this as Putin being a problem. Like in 2006, we had Alexander Litvinenko, who was a former Russian FSB officer and a critic of the Kremlin, who was poisoned with radioactive polonium-210 in London in November in 2006. And that was a British inquiry concluded that this murder was probably approved by Putin himself. And then in 2018, you had Sergei Skripal, who was a former Russian military officer and a double agent for the UK's intelligence services. And they were poisoned with Novichok. Do you remember that in Salisbury, which was absolutely terrifying? There have been a number of cyber attacks targeting British institutions, and that included government agencies and infrastructure. But as well as that, almost the things that I remember that were almost more terrifying were that we've had Russian naval vessels, including warships and submarines, detected in British waters on several occasions. We've had Russian military aircraft, including bombers and reconnaissance planes, occasionally violating British airspace or flying close to the UK airspace without authorisation. And then we had that exercise in 2017, exercise Zapad, which is Russian for the West, where they did this big military exercise in. It was in Russia, but I mean, it's hard to mistake what it was all about. So the narrative is really complicated. The other thing, all the other stuff to do with it is to do with the West's encroachment, or what Putin says the narrative is the the encroachment of NATO on Russia so that Russia feels threatened. I think you have to understand that when you understand their response. But then you've got Tucker Carlson going in there into a situation where it's obvious that he was going to be manipulated by Putin, and Putin would not have given that interview if he wasn't confident that that he wanted to dominate that narrative and give a message to the American people. And he sure did give that message, didn't he? First of all, he did this big, long historical thing about, like Ukraine being and he kept going into these monologues, and Carlson just let him do it. And then, I don't think Carlson got any hits in there at all, and it just seemed very a sort of a weak thing. So you come out of it, then we're in a situation where you've got Navalny's, who was the main political opponent, has just been killed, and he's killed at a time when you've got the Munich conference taking place, which is the security conference where all the EU, like the NATO leaders, are there to talk about what's like the security position in the world at the moment. And you can see that this is only going to, his death is only going to galvanise them into action against Putin. So that makes you scratch your head and go, why would Putin do that? But when you look at Skripal and all these other things, Putin just seems to act with complete impunity. He doesn't care, who dies, and that's kind of what you see going on in Ukraine. So for me, I've got this conflict going on, which is surely the Ukrainians have got the right to self-determine, but at the same time, the idea that Christianity can rebuild Russian civilization, that is something that ticks a lot of, it rings the right sort of bells in lots of ways, especially with the decay that we see. It's inarguable. Yeah. Everyone says that our Western culture is decaying. As we've abandoned Christianity, we've embraced all these progressive ideas, the cohesion of our society, lots of different elements. So you can see it all breaking apart. And Putin, I think, at the outset of the Ukrainian thing, was looking to make the most of those divisions. But instead, what he seemed to do was unite NATO against him. So it's a very complex situation. And I know Gavin's some really interesting insights into it as well.
Well, yeah, they you talked about Navalny being killed, and he didn't really need to be killed. He was no great threat at that time to Putin. But the one argument that the killing of him, whips people up against Russia, and therefore will be more likely to avoid a Republican win. So I think the question for you, Gavin, now I have a Catholic friend who said there's quite a lot of Catholic LARPing going on, and we see it in the culture, live action role play. So it's convenient sometimes to adopt positions that are Catholic without actually participating in a Catholic life, without actually truly living a Catholic life. It's a bit like the cafeteria Catholicism. So there are you hear in it's similar to what's been said by Tom Holland in Dominion, that there is now unambiguously there's this recognition that Christianity gave us and gives us something that we are now losing, and we're fracturing and we're crumbling. But does it matter if orthodoxy, if Christianity is adopted by Putin or by a nation as a means to a political end? There are a lot of people who said Trump was really pro-life, and whether he really was pro-life or not, we don't know. He appointed Amy Coney Barrett, and that swung things, and that was a great pro-life move that helped to overturn Roe v. Wade. But in a sense, they're saying, well, Trump is really just about himself, and there are people now who will be, Trump. And it's true that the Middle East was more stable than it has been under Trump, so there's a reason to keep him out. But for our Catholic viewers, does it matter if there's a real faith behind this, or if it's just the adoption of something for these political ends?
Well, it's important, isn't it, to know whether we're going to speak politically or pneumatically. I'm very hesitant to speak politically because it runs a risk of dividing people and being misunderstood. As it happens, I'm a great fan of John Mearsheimer, the realist, who I've been listening to for 10 years. So I'll leave that there. People who know him know what I'm talking about. Let's go back to Our Lady in Fatima. Our Lady's been saying for some time that salvation for Christendom and for the Church will come from the East and even from Russia. And it seems to me that whatever Putin believes personally, we're in a situation which is very awkward for us in the West. That Russian civilization appears to be deliberately, according to the Zmirak article, appears to be deliberately adopting Christianity as a foundation to build a successful civilization on. And the reason this is very awkward for us is that our culture in the West is deliberately rejecting Christianity as a way of apparently destroying our civilization, so it seems. So this places us in a really problematic situation, because politically and nationalistically, we might be more sympathetic with a regime that defends its children from being hypersexualized when ours are being taught in sex education classes to do unspeakable things. This is a dilemma for us, and it's very difficult. And I want to avoid, as I think Tucker hasn't avoided, being drawn into the political arguments, but to try and remain, if you like, spiritually aligned, in preference to being politically aligned. I think one of the reasons that's important is that, as it happens, I've got two reasons for being personal here. One is those subways you saw in the Tucker Carlson videos. I spent days avoiding KGB tales on those subways as I tried to deliver Bibles and medicine to the Orthodox people who were hiding from the regime in the 1980s. I know them very well. They are extraordinary places. But at the same time, recently I was involved in a seminar with Alexander Dugin. Dugin's become a hate figure. People see him as a kind of Rasputin advisor for Putin. And his daughter was blown up and killed in an assassination attempt a few months ago. Dugin's interesting because one of the things he says is that we're without a prevailing political philosophy that works at the moment. Fascism has failed. Communism's failed. Liberalism, which is poisoning us now, has failed. And what he thinks that he's trying to do in Russia for Putin, with Putin, is to find a new fourth macro philosophy. So they're building an element of nationalism into a kind of a form of neo-Christian nationalism. This is, again, very difficult for us because our nationalism has been taken away. I'm starting to reread Chesterton again, and I love Napoleon of Notting Hill, where Chesterton is very much in favour of localism, people being locally accountable, having local identities. And one of the things happening in the West is our localism is being destroyed and our nationalism is being destroyed. So we're unable to take part in a new philosophical re-engineering of a form of Christianized nationalism. But the Russians are. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens, both politically and spiritually. And one of the things the only sensible thing I think I can say is it's going to require a lot of wisdom to divide political analysis from spiritual discernment. But I think that's one of the things we have to try and do.
I think that's a great point, really. And I just find it very difficult to see anything positive spiritually out of Russia invading Ukraine and killing, their brothers and sisters there. And I just can't see a way that we can justify the invasion. I think is my biggest problem. And so the other point that I think is important is that from the UK's point of view, we've now, under Boris Johnson, we were one of the most ardent backers of Ukraine. And it's extremely worrying. What I'm trying to build a picture of here is us heading towards, being prepared by the people in power for war. They seem to be they're trying to prepare us for war. That's what worries me. And that war.
I think the thing you said is a very good example of the thing I'm trying to avoid, and we can't avoid. You see, the head of the British Army said that one of the reasons we were getting involved with Ukraine was because he wanted an LGBT cultural victory in Ukraine. We wanted to teach the Russians a lesson in terms of gay supremacy. That's what the head of the British Army said. The reason we were giving support. So in that sense, I'm not in favour of that. I'm not on the side of the British Army or NATO. But the Russians see it as a clash of civilizations. They see it as they're trying to resist. They say that, whether they're telling the truth or not, they say they're seeing it as a clash of civilizations in which they're defending Christian culture against the heterodox pernicious sexualization culture, which the EU, NATO, and all our political leaders say they're fighting for. And that puts us in a very difficult position, because spiritually and ethically, we're on the side of the Russians. But politically and nationalistically, in terms of civil rights, we're obviously belong to our own culture. And this is enormously difficult, I think, for us. And that's one of the reasons why I'm trying to keep out of the politics, because if we talk politically, we have to be on the side of the British general who said we're doing this for LGBT rights. And if we talk spiritually, that runs the risk of us making us political allies of the Russians. I'm not a political ally of Putin in any remote sense whatsoever. I'm not a political supporter of the mafia Russian regime in any sense whatsoever. But I do want to be allowed to say that if I'm being drawn into an LGBT plus sexualization of children campaign that's taking place at a military level and politically, I'm not part of that. And one of the difficulties I think the church has in the West is how do we distance ourselves from the people who are patriotically telling us that we need to get ready for a third world war with Russia, when Russia's saying what they're trying to do is present the sexualization of their children. This leaves us in a very awkward position, and I don't really know how to articulate the way out of it.
Well, I think we've done a good job of pulling out the many facets in it, that the things that we see as positive on whatever side, and that's not to say that we're on one side or the other. It's just the way that we're considering the facts and in light of our faith, sort of thing.
Yeah, and the danger of looking for political answers. As Gavin said, you might say, well, of course, this is something that we're against, but it doesn't politically align us necessarily. And I think that's the danger, and that's what C.S. Lewis always reminds us, is the danger of being drawn. And we are in such a time of polarization. And I think that there's attempts to pull us, even as Christians and as Catholics, one way or the other. And I think we have to be careful to avoid that, because if we take our eye off that telos, then and we make it a political telos, what's the political end? Then we've gone awry. So and of course the answer is, as irritating as it might be to mention it, especially when we're dealing with such huge scale world problems, is striving for holiness and sanctity in our own lives.
So let's avoid the politics of who's killing who and whose empire is stronger than who. What we need to do is subvert the secular culture that's overwhelmed us by re-educating our children in Catholic virtue. Now so this is partly why I'm being drawn back to Chesterton as an author and an intellectual and a Catholic prophet, but also one of the things we can do is not get involved in World War III, but get involved in trying to recapture our children by starting Catholic education, particularly along the Chesterton Academy model, which is brilliant. So I think that's one of the ways of putting into practice the advice that Katherine was giving us a few moments ago.
Which we know from our trip to America is very, very good, the Chesterton Academy. And Mark mentioned subsidiarity, looking at Catholic social teaching, looking at those principles, because you talked about Trump, and Trump is a polarizing figure, but there are some things that Trump either purposefully or accidentally achieved that are absolutely fantastic and wonderful and dignify us as human persons, and there are other things that are awful. So I think we've got to be careful when we align ourselves politically and say, I'm absolutely sticking here and I'm rigid. So if we look at the principles and say, I see this is something to celebrate and this is something not, then it's about those principles rather than the people or the that we get hooked on the cult of personality, which is a danger, whether it's charismatic figures, both in a sense, Putin and Trump, Biden less so, but there's a danger of being drawn and we can lose sight of the principles rather than the people. For time, I know we might need to leave it there. Not that there isn't a lot more to discuss, but perhaps we'll meet later this week and talk further on those issues. I wonder, Mark, since you're the tech wizard, whether you've got a moment just to pull up that photo I sent of my Emily to finish with, a nice piece of news that my eldest stepdaughter, hello Emily, was presented to Archbishop John Wilson today in the rite of election at Southwark Cathedral.
Oh, superb.
There we are. Since you failed to put it up, there she is, my Emily. Where are you?
Superb.
There. And Archbishop John Wilson. So in preparation for her being received into the church at this Easter Vigil. So thank you to those of you who are old and long-standing viewers of Catholic Unscripted. You'll know that maybe a year ago, just short of a year ago, we did an episode answering some of Emily's questions, and I've asked that you pray for her. And so thank you to all those of you that have been praying for my eldest stepdaughter, Emily. Well done, Emily.
Put it on an
Good news.
Well done, Emily. And
Thanks.
well done, Archbishop John.
Yeah, God bless you, Emily.
Yeah. Right, that's it for episode 55. Do please take a look at the website, and remember we have only a few remaining tickets for our spring retreat, May 17th to 19th. So have a look and see if you can grab one of those while there's still an early bird discount for just a couple more days, I think. So there's maybe 8 tickets left. So please take a look. We'd love to see you there. We're looking forward to it, and we'll give you more details about the programme very shortly. But for now, I'm Katherine Bennett.
I'm Mark Lambert.
I'm Gavin Ashenden. Happy Lent.